This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international programme of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and as I record, it's 40 years to the day since Star Trek first made the transition to the cinema screen with the release of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, as some of you will know, the release schedule for that particular film was somewhat rushed. Famously, the reels of film was sent to the theatres with the film still drying while they were in transit. So it was a film that was really rushed out in its initial release. And to mark the anniversary of this kind of momentous moment in Star Trek history, I wanted to share with you a short recording that I made a few weeks ago when I and some friends from the Destination Star Trek convention went together to see one of the series of anniversary screenings that there have been around the country. We went to see this film on the big screen, I think all of us for the first time seeing it in the cinema, and for one of them actually the first time seeing this film all together. So I was joined by some voices you may recognise from the recent recording made at Destination Star Trek by Drew Barker, who's been on this podcast a couple of times, by Dana Kazim and by Ben Keeling. And we were viewing the film at the Prince Charles Cinema in Leicester Square. So here's a little recording of our thoughts immediately after seeing it up on the big screen for the first time. So we are at the Prince Charles Cinema in London's West End, Leicester Square, the centre of London. We've just been seeing a very old print, I think an original print of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And I'm kind of curious, I don't know about you guys, for me personally, I've seen this film a few times over the years, but never on the big screen. I've always seen it. Last time I watched it, I was saying to Drew, I watched it on my iPad. So this was a very different experience. But I'm kind of interested, first of all, what were your kind of first impressions tonight of seeing it up there on the big screen?
It was great. Yeah, I mean, seeing it in the big screen. It's just an epic film. I know it's called the motionless picture in a bit of a jokey way, but even though it is slow, it's just epic. The scenes and the visuals, they're really a great looking thing. They're part of the film that just make it look really big, even if it is done in a slow way.
The effects really stand up, I think. I mean, even as much as this was an old print, you could see a lot of scratching, a lot of kind of damage to it. The colour was way off most of the time, I think. But the actual visual effects of the cloud came across really well, I thought.
Yeah, definitely. I think they definitely look really good still. I mean, I think it takes a big page out of 2001 in a lot of it, which probably helped. But yeah, I totally agree. It looks really good and stands up to modern day sci-fi, I'd say.
I was quite impressed with the visuals. I mean, I've watched this movie about a few times as well, and it was all, done should I say done right? Should I say done to the modern standards, I'd say, right? And I can tell that this movie's been tossed around a little bit with all the scratches, the different kind of colors that you've mentioned, and it makes me appreciate cinema back in the day. I'm a new gen cinema fan, should I say. I'm so used to all these fancy things that Marvel throws out. This was just so interesting to see back in how other people used to see, or how our parents used to see it, I suppose, which is really interesting. Which also makes me feel like I need to focus a little bit more on the story. So that was something that I paid attention to, rather than, oh, does this look good or that look good, or can I hear this right? I thought, okay, so what are they really trying to say here?
And it's kind of an interesting film because, I mean, as much as people criticise it for its pacing and so on, it is quite long, it is quite slow. There is a very interesting kind of strange, weird story there. That's one of the things I sort of appreciated about it on this viewing, I think, was just how weird this film is and how kind of it does sort of draw you in if you give yourself up to it. I'm curious, Ben, you'd actually never seen the motion picture before, so this was your first experience altogether. So I'm curious, what did you make of it?
Well, it was actually really interesting for me. I felt like this... bear in mind, this is not just my first time seeing this film. I'm very unfamiliar with the original series beyond the staples that we've all heard and the catchphrases, damn it, Jim, and all of that. But for me, this really captured what I think Star Trek was originally all about, especially in The Next Generation and the original series, which was about discovering new life and exploring the unknown in particular, which is, I mean, you've got those huge, long, beautiful shots of no one has any idea what when you're scrolling across the ship and going through those wonderful patterns in the clouds. And it really allows the viewer to sort of go, wow, I have no idea what's out there. And that, I think, is what the original... I mean, I've seen one episode and you get that impression that it's all about discovering and problem solving and trying to understand the world out there. So I thought it was really exciting for me in the sense that it captivated what I think Star Trek is at its core about. Not that it necessarily is that anymore, but that's where it's come from.
Absolutely. I think it captures some of that weirdness of the original series. And in some ways, you could say from Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, that kind of era of Star Trek, it maybe all became a bit more... not necessarily safe, not necessarily predictable, but there was a bit more of a kind of rational context for everything somehow. Whereas in the original series, you did have a bit more kind of wacky weirdness going on. And I guess this film absolutely sits on that sort of boundary very well. It does have this big sort of strong, almost kind of metaphysical, kind of spiritual aspect to it, which I think works reasonably well, as I say, if you can kind of forgive it the pacing and so on. There is always something to take out of it anyway. I mean, I think you're right, Drew, absolutely. They were going for a kind of 2001 vibe. Now, that's a film that people find absolutely kind of transcendental one way or another, but equally involves a lot of very weird imagery and a lot of kind of slightly mysterious, unclear storytelling to some extent. But has that kind of feeling of a sort of an art film almost. And I suppose, I don't know if this film is quite going that far, but I think of all the Star Trek films, it's the one that kind of goes the most in that direction, insofar as you do feel you're sort of sitting there and witnessing something strange going on, rather than, like you were saying, it's very much not a kind of Marvel entertainment, like, or even like, to be honest, most of the Star Trek films are kind of action adventure films. This is a weird one. There's not actually that much action. The human adventure, as we understand, is just beginning, because maybe there wasn't, wasn't that much action adventure in the film anyway. There was adventure of a kind of more metaphysical kind.
Yeah, it's strange actually, because I think it's well known that this film was produced by Paramount in reaction to Star Wars coming out, and in some ways it's so different to Star Wars. Star Wars is action adventure, and this is just like intelligent sci-fi. Really, I think it is at its core quite hard, intelligent science fiction.
I was just going to ask, so this came out in, was it 69?
79.
79. Oh, 79. Yeah. So how long was this after the original series cancelled?
10 years.
10 years. Yeah. So I really thought that when there was that first scene and you see the Enterprise in, I want to say the dry dock up in space, and there's this beautiful 10-minute, totally unnecessary, but wonderful scene as you see them, and in a wonderful moment, because normally you get the Enterprise in relation to planets and stars, and there's no sense of scale, but you get to see Kirk and Scotty next to it, and you get to see how they compare to it, and you get to see them with this creature that they love, which I thought was really wonderful. It was you get the impression that this is how every fan must have felt when they came back 10 years later to thank God my cult show that died has been brought back from the dead. It was really magical, I thought.
I think that's a big part of it. And also, actually, one thing watching on the big screen that I never really picked out before is that scene on the recreation deck where you've got all of those extras, and all of those extras I think were fans of the show who had been kind of, I don't know how they organised that, how they got those people in, but they were people who Star Trek meant a lot to. And that must have just been an amazing experience for them to like see themselves on screen. But also I just love the fact on the big screen you can actually sort of zero in on them. You can see their faces. There's one woman who is likely a Native American woman, has got some kind of feathers in her hair and stuff going on. They're kind of interesting characters there just in the background. And I suppose the film originally was fulfilling this role of, this is this show that's been cancelled, that's gone away for a long time. Now it's back. Star Trek is back. But yeah, absolutely, as you're saying, the Enterprise is back. And as much as that scene, it does play as slightly ridiculous today, I suppose we can't underestimate how meaningful that was to people back then who didn't have Netflix with the whole of the original series at their disposal. They probably they were relying on reruns to even see it, and as much as some of the visual side of it, I mean the effects of the cloud look amazing. Some of the kind of model effects I think you can see on this print anyway, you can see the lines around them, they don't quite seem to join up perfectly. I mean, I've almost, I think, only ever seen this film in the remastered version, and I was a bit shocked going back, a bit like with the original series, when you go back, if you've got used to watching the remastered ones, then you go back and watch an old one, you're like, oh yeah, that is what it used to look like, when I was watching it after school, whatever. So I suppose there is that sort of sense of seeing it as it originally was, and that's the benefit, I guess, of watching one of these 35mm screenings like this, is you do almost get transported back in time somehow.
No, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that I think was a little special about this movie compared to the other movies as well was I thought this movie would do really well as just a 2-part episode, whereas I don't think that really applies to the other movies. I think, as you kind of mentioned before, they're more action driven, I suppose, where this is genuinely a big, quiet adventure movie. But I think one of the things that really, I'd say, I appreciate a little bit more, just going back to what you mentioned, is I finally get to appreciate what my parents saw in the cinemas, I suppose. But now I can understand when they go to a cinema, they go, oh, everything's so different. Why is it so colorful? Everything's so in my face. Yeah. Precisely. That's exactly it. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. And I suppose this film, in terms of the kind of colour palette, I mean, admittedly, we were seeing it today with the colours somewhat distorted. I would say there were some very pink scenes, there were some very blue scenes, but I mean, a lot of brown scenes. Yeah, but all I was going to say is actually the motion picture, that was a big decision that was taken then to really mute the colours of Star Trek. You don't have those kind of primary colours. You do have these kind of beige pyjamas everywhere, which, in some ways I think was potentially a misstep for Star Trek. It's something they never really, I don't think, have gone back to exactly, but it did give it a very different look, a different style. The fact you can see the hairs on Captain Kirk's arms kind of, it brings a different element somehow, one way or another.
It does, and as well, seeing it on the big screen as well, you appreciate they probably should have worn thicker underwear, some of the men.
I don't know what you were looking at, Drew.
Yeah, it was there on the screen in huge, 4 foot wide vision there. But also, when Bones beams on, and it's like the classic disco Bones, I mean, it's an excellent...
The medallion.
Yeah, the 70s. And I guess it's the whole film's influenced by the 70s with the brown beige. I mean, you were talking about when they was in the observation lounge as well. I'd never really noticed before, seeing it on the big screen. Now you can see it in detail. A lot of it's carpeted, and the walls look carpeted. It almost looks a little bit like The Next Generation when it first started, and everything was like all carpeted. It's definitely that late 70s, early 80s kind of look coming on to the screen.
Well, and a certain amount, of course, was carried forward for The Next Generation in terms of, the relationship between Deckard and Ilia being transposed to Riker and Troy, for example. And a lot of that, obviously, was a legacy of the fact that this film came out of a TV series that never happened, this Phase 2 series, and the kind of repurposing of storylines and material from that. And even the guy who was supposed to be the Vulcan character who crops up as a human early on that space station, they sort of threw him a little part, I guess, as a kind of compensation for having missed out big time. I sort of feel like he's the kind of real life Decker, isn't he? In a way, you know, the guy who's been passed over for this great job that he thought he'd won, and yet, you know, here he is. It's an interesting element of the film, though, I think, as well, how it casts Kirk, because, you know, there's that episode of the animated series with the Kirk as a jerk t-shirt. I feel like this in the films is the beginning of Kirk as a jerk being sort of part of his personality going forward somehow, because you do see it. I mean, yes, I suppose as viewers we are relieved that it's Kirk in the captain's chair, but the film really goes out of its way to show him not necessarily being the right person for that job.
Yeah. I wonder if this is just kind of evolution of the character. So potentially they think that, right, let's go back to the original series. What was Kirk like, and what do we think he's going to be in, let's say, 10 years? Interestingly enough, the music has just come on. Perfect. So I wonder if this is just kind of the production's kind of interpretation of what they think future Kirk's going to be like. Still possessive about the Enterprise? Probably so.
Yeah, absolutely. He's never going to let go, as we see as a kind of theme running running throughout the movies. Well, I'm kind of interested as well. I mean, this was my first time seeing the motion picture on the big screen. It takes me back as well to my first time seeing a Star Trek movie on the big screen, which, funnily enough, was literally just around the corner at the Empire, Leicester Square. And for me, that was Star Trek Generations. So I never saw any of the original series movies on the big screen. It was when the Next Gen made that leap that I started going to the cinema. I'm curious, what about you guys? What was your first sort of Star Trek experience in the cinema?
Well, I can actually remember going to see Wrath of Khan. I would have been 7 at the time, possibly a little bit too young to watch it cinema. But I think it was actually near here as well. I very big memories of my dad won tickets to see it in the up the West End, which was a big thing back then, 1984, I think. Yeah. And yeah, I remember seeing it, being very frightened by the bugs in the ears, and it's a good experience though. But yeah, that's my earliest cinema experience of Star Trek.
And had you been a fan of the original series? You know, had you been watching them in reruns? I mean, you were familiar with these characters, but in a smaller context, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the classic. My dad was a massive Trekkie, so it's my bread and butter is Star Trek and Captain Kirk. So yeah, it's in my blood, Star Trek, really, from my dad, really. So yeah, I've seen pretty much every Star Trek film at the cinema and enjoyed them all.
And what about you, Dana?
Well, I started watching Star Trek when I was about 15, so that means all the original series and the Next Gen movies have already gone in cinemas and out of cinemas. So the first Star Trek movie I've actually seen on big screen was one of the Kelvin timeline movies, right? Which is pretty exciting because for me, I thought, you know, it was in the middle of Dubai, and I didn't know any other Trekkies in Dubai. And my parents got me into it. They thought, you like sci-fi? This is a good show. And when I walked into the cinema, actually waiting for the movie to the movie to start, one of the guys in the crowd yelled "Khan" on the top of his lungs, and I felt great about that. So it was great, it was exciting. But I have to admit, watching the new movie was so different because I'd obviously finished the original series and then the Next Generation and watched those movies on my laptop at that point, and they've been remastered, and I thought they were pretty exciting, pretty awesome. But then I went to see this one in cinema, and it was just so different. Everything was blue, there was so much light coming out, but I was almost fascinated, I suppose.
You see, I'm one of those guys, I don't know you, Drew, but might be too, who slightly struggles with the Kelvin movies, because all the stuff that your parents say about the Marvel movies, I have slightly the same reaction to them. And as much as there are elements in them that I enjoy, you know, and I do enjoy them, but for me, I suppose you could say there's a spectrum, and maybe the motion picture is at one end, the Kelvin timeline movies are at the other. For me, like somewhere in the middle is the sort of sweet spot for what I want from a Star Trek movie. But what about you, Ben? Have you seen other Star Trek movies in the cinema before this one?
Well, you know what? I did watch, similarly, the other films would have been way before my time, but the Kelvin movies, I think I must have been at university at the time, and I had absolutely no money, so no, I didn't see those in the cinema. So this is my first Star Trek experience in the cinema. I know you've taken my first time, and honestly, I mean, it's sort of slightly biased because I've blasted through Deep Space Nine and Voyager now. We're getting through Enterprise and watching a few bits and pieces here and there. honestly, I think this is a great start. Like, I love that this is a big, warm introductory hug for Star Trek. It embraces the nostalgia. It embraces the whole the motto of Star Trek, which is exploration and the unknown, and working together to communicate and overcome problems, not necessarily with violence, although we all love a good action scene every now and then. So I think it was great. Yeah, I'm really happy to say that's a great starting point, and hopefully everything else will be slightly better as well. But I think it was a really lovely intro for me.
Well, I think if you love this one, then you're going to be really impressed by the next one, I have to say. But look out for a screening, because some of us, were you there when they screened that here a year or two ago? Yeah, you might be able to find a screening of the Wrath of Khan, and it's definitely that is worth seeing on the big screen again, because I mean that is a step up, I think most people would say, and certainly in terms of pacing and kind of and that balance, I guess, between, you see, that for me, that's what you really want from a Star Trek movie, is that balance between sort of action, adventure, character, drama. Do you know what I mean? All of the elements kind of in there, with a bit more of a human touch, maybe. Whereas I suppose the motion picture has this slightly, like you were saying, it's a bit sort of hard sci-fi. It's a little bit kind of, it's not exactly detached. I mean, there is, you've got McCoy kind of grounding it quite a lot of great one-liners that, in the cinema were really getting the big laughs of the film. But there is still that slight feeling that there's something slightly kind of intellectual or abstract about it on some level, maybe. Wrath of Khan very much sort of pushing in the opposite direction, I'd say. I mean, what about you guys then, who've seen at least all the Star Trek movies, whether in the cinema or not? I mean, what do you think it is that really we look for? Because I guess when they were making this movie, they weren't just trying to recreate the TV series. I mean, that would have been the easy thing to do, would be to get the old uniforms back together, just kind of almost do a film. And you do see that sometimes with TV shows when they go over to the movies, that it's very much about capturing the aesthetic, capturing the kind of dynamic, everything about the original. With this one, there was very much a conscious decision to sort of push it in a slightly different direction, to kind of remold it, reshape it. But I'm curious, when you go to the cinema for a Star Trek movie, what is it that you're looking for that isn't what you got on the small screen?
Well, personally for me, and I'm going to give you a specific example for this, I really enjoyed The Next Generation. And when I looked at the Next Generation movies, the one thing I wanted Captain Picard to show that much more emotion. So I felt like First Contact was that for me. I wanted to see the human behind the captain. I understand with Starfleet, it's a strict code and you have to be at your best at all time. And I feel like, especially with Captain Picard, it's got his stuff all together quite well. And for the First Contact, I felt like that really put it together quite well. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think that's what I kind of look for in the movies. Might be a little, different answer, I suppose, than what people would usually expect, but I want to see the human side of the Starfleet officers a little bit more, because I think a movie is a good place to explore that.
That's an interesting point. I mean, because I suppose there is that sense that with a movie, you can take the character on a bit more of a journey. I mean, I know there was a feeling with the Next Gen writers when they were sort of going into doing the movies there, particularly with someone like Data. I think they sort of felt like they could push him a bit further. They could do new things. They didn't have to put all the toys back in the box at the end of the film necessarily. And definitely, I think the original series really make the most of that, because you do see, certainly with Kirk, you do see a progression of that character, and you see him pushed into, I don't want to spoil the Wrath of Khan for you here, Ben, but pushed in directions that you maybe wouldn't expect, that are not necessarily the safe, dramatic choices. So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that in a way that the films open up, particularly for the original series, where there was absolutely this episodic structure, continuity required, that everything had to reset completely at the end of every episode. You do have this opportunity to tell this story moving through time, and with characters aging and changing to the extent that there is this sort of question in this film even, are these characters the same people that we know and loved? Because Kirk sort of seems like basically the same guy, but he's got a little bit of an edge to him that maybe we're not totally comfortable with. He is slightly screwing other people around. Do we entirely trust him? Both McCoy and Spock come on board pretty hostile, frankly, and Kirk keeps saying, I need you. He seems to be having this real crisis. He's like, I can command the Enterprise, but only with these two guys. McCoy is not for it at all. He's pretty pissed off to begin with. Spock comes on board, and there's that amazing scene where everyone's like sort of gushing over Spock, and they're all saying, "Oh, it's so great to see you, Mr. Spock. You know, how have you been? Tell us about your holiday." You know, and Spock is just like, "No, not interested."
Doesn't even raise one of his slanted eyebrows. I was amazed by that because I have seen like an episode or two, and he always seemed, at least fairly benign. But he came on and he was actively. I thought, wow, I want to give this guy a good punch. Like he's really miserable. But then there was the moment after he mind melded with Vija. Not to spoil anything. Spoiler alert. Sorry.
It's okay, this film's 40 years old. I think we're allowed to spoil it by now.
Fair point. So he goes for the mind meld, and then there's this sort of uncontrollable laughter as he's lying there in sickbay, and you go, oh, okay, that's weird, but it's a step in the right direction.
That's almost, we've got the old Spock back to some extent, insofar as, you're right, I think, with Spock, yes, there's this kind of cool aloofness, but there is also a real sense of humour, a real kind of charm. And it's interesting, even in that scene with Spock and McCoy, you get that great sense where they're sort of trading barbs in a sense. But when Spock says to McCoy, whatever his lines about your predilection for irrelevancies, there's something quite cutting about it. And several people sort of almost gasped in the cinema. I think at that line, they were like, wow, that's, that was harsh.
Yeah, I totally agree, really. I mean, it's good because I don't think if they'd come back 10 years later with exactly the same personalities and that, it would have been very good, really. And I mean, obviously Spock's gone away to Vulcan and he's tried to purge all of his emotions, and that's where this is coming from. So it's good that they're carrying on the continuity of it all, really. So it's great.
Absolutely. Well, any final thoughts before we go on the motion picture, on seeing it up on the big screen, on what that adds to your experience as a fan? Because we've got these films, we can go back to them, rewatch them whenever we want. As I say, they're all, I don't know if the films are on Netflix, but they're all, they're easily accessible from your tablet or your laptop or whatever. But it's quite rare, actually, to have a chance to see these movies in the cinema. And this is one of a series of special 40th anniversary screenings. We may be getting, I think, in a year or two's time, the remastered version kind of upgraded and potentially re-released, which I think would be a real improvement in many ways, because you would be able to watch it. Maybe it wouldn't feel quite so much like we're going back in time. At the same time, there wouldn't be those distractions of the kind of wondering, is there a reason why this entire scene seems to be pink, or or this one seems to be blue. So any final thoughts or any kind of hopes for the future or expectations?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really surprised me in this, and I did actually, because I thought I might say this story, I tried to look up what classification this is, and it was you that came up on the screen. And that really surprises me, because this has got one of the most horrific scenes in all of film, and that is the transporter malfunction thing. I mean, that absolutely terrified me as a child. I saw that very young. And it's horrible, isn't it? It really is grotesque. And quite often when you get these kind of social media things, what scared you as a child, the two of them come up. It's either the head in Jaws at the hull of the boat, or it's a transport thing. Yeah. This film, that scene should not mean that this is a U, should it? This should be a 15 or more, really, shouldn't it?
It is kind of horrific in a way. And I suppose the difference between that and maybe some of the kind of body horror stuff in the Wrath of Khan is that it effectively takes place off screen. You barely see it. Although actually I did notice, again, seeing it on the big screen, you could see a little bit more of those figures kind of writhing in agony and so on. And there's that great line, well, what we got back didn't live long. It's pretty grim.
That person on the other end sounds so sarcastic. Who is that? That's terrible.
Yeah, someone didn't seem all that bothered. But also Kirk in that scene, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, Kirk obviously is alarmed and sort of distressed, but also seems pretty pissed off about it. And he has that weird line to Rand. He says, don't blame yourself, Rand, it wasn't your fault. A, it wasn't, because he took the controls. Clearly, if it's anyone's fault, it's his. But B, he seems so unconvincing. Saying that, you sort of feel sorry for her. She's obviously really shocked by what's happened, and he's made absolutely no effort to genuinely make her feel better.
to be honest, I was thinking about this right at the end where he goes, Starfleet, list two casualties. And he goes, no, wait, they're missing. And I was like, what about the two people that got absolutely mauled and mutilated? There's like a stain on Starfleet's like transporter pad back at base. I was like, we'll just ignore them. They're fine. It's a happy ending.
Yeah. I guess they figured they already knew about those two. That was like, maybe he was like that. Yeah, they're not my casualties. That's on you. You beamed them over here. They didn't make it. You beamed them back again. That's not going on my... Because Kirk's got presumably quite a kind of long list of casualties attached to his name from his 5-year mission and so on. He probably doesn't want to... In fact, maybe that's why he decided to list those two as missing. Because he's like, can I get away with it? Just about. Okay, that will, exactly. Yeah. That'll kind of make the statistics work slightly more in my favour, assuming that I'm hoping to get my second 5-year mission off the back of all this. Well, it's kind of an interesting ending, I suppose, that film has as well. And this is the period, weirdly, if you do go and watch The Wrath of Khan, one of the things that's very confusing about the chronology is that the chronology in universe and the chronology in the real world are sort of out of sync. So as I understand it, and I've always been a bit unclear on this, but there is intended to have been a second 5-year mission after this film and before The Wrath of Khan, right, that we never see or really talk about. So there is that sense at the end of this film that they're going off to a new start. And I suppose you've got Spock saying, I don't need to go back to Vulcan, I'm done. And presumably Bones, as grumpy as he seemed to be, is going to tag along for the ride. And this is the crew now. And we kind of have ended up pretty much back with the original crew, even though it seemed like we were getting all these new characters. They've all disappeared one way or another. So it kind of, we have sort of finally got the toys back in the box, but only almost in the last 5 minutes. So I suppose there is that sort of sense that you could say in the same way as Next Gen on the TV ended with this sense of actually we're off for the next adventure, it's just you're not coming next time. The film does sort of, as much as it resets everything for a kind of cinematic storytelling, it also kind of doesn't really lead to any forward continuity in a sense, because it does seem to end by saying, okay, everyone is back where you wanted them. And then the strange thing, I suppose, is that the original series films going forward don't pick up on that. They do something very different. Again, I don't want to spoil it for you, for you too much, Ben. But, they don't just continue with the adventures of the second 5-year mission or of the Enterprise kind of under Kirk. They kind of have to problematize everything and kind of throw everything up again and give us a lot more personal drama and so on along the way.
Of course. Now, I think they kind of leave it potentially open-ended like that so they can discuss, should we do the series again? Should we do another movie? Right? So I feel like it's a little bit intentional. But I wonder if this is a good time to drop it in. I was actually reading about the origins of the Borg during the week, and one of the theories was V'ger. So I'm wondering as well, like, is that potentially also left open-ended so that they can potentially explore it sometime in the future, such as the Picard series? I'm not entirely sure. But you're right. There is a big gap, I'd say, before they actually start Wrath of Khan, and you're sat there going like, okay, so now there's more character evolution, but what exactly happened, I suppose, in the middle? I'm not sure.
Well, that would be a bold bit of continuity, I think, to bring back V'ger in the Picard series. That would be truly, that would be interesting, and find out what happened there. Because there is a slight sense, I suppose, I mean, take it more seriously for a moment, that idea of saying we're going to list them as missing, not as deceased, in a sense, is kind of saying on some metaphysical level we don't really know whether they exist or not, but it does almost sort of hint at that there could be a future story here. Do you know what I mean? This whole situation seems to have gone away, but they don't really know what they have witnessed, and there is that kind of sense of what's going to come next. And the fact that at the end of the film you get this title card, The Human Adventure is Just Beginning, is very much giving this sort of sense of this is the birth of something new. This is a kind of a moment that future stories can kind of move forward from. Of course, albeit that when it came to it, they didn't really. And who knows, maybe if Gene Roddenberry had held the reins a bit more on the movies, that we would have seen more of that kind of continuity going forward. Whereas as it was, what we got was something quite different, a kind of another left turn into a slightly different direction. Well, before we go, why don't you let our listeners know where they can track you down on social media if they want to argue the pros and cons of this film, in particular, if they want to spoil the rest of the original series movies for Ben. Don't do that. That would be a Kirk is a jerk kind of thing to do. True.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, T23TY, or I'm always on the Babel conference.
feel I should ask you, and I don't know why I've never done this, but what does T232Y stand for? Because most people who are in Star Trek, they have some like obviously, 1701 something or whatever. What does this, what's the meaning behind this?
Well, that was the shortest name I could find that was available, and it's as fair as that.
Okay, I can't argue with that. Ben?
I'm on social media, but I don't think you'll be able to find me. I think I'm privatized, much like the
NHS.
You're up there. Oh yeah, well, I was so close to saying that. I thought, is that controversial? So I'm probably not findable.
Okay, fair enough. Off the grid. No, that's just as well. So you won't have your entertainment spoiled. Yeah. And you.
Well, unfortunately, a little bit like Ben, I'm not on Twitter because I don't know if I can say everything I want to say within the characters that they let me, to be fair. But I have learned that you can kind of continue. Anyways, you'd be able to find me on Instagram, I suppose, and Facebook. So just look up my name. And we can talk Star Trek.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you all for joining me. It's been fun seeing the motion picture on the big screen and fun having a chat about it afterwards. But talking about Star Trek the Motion Picture is not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
I knew from the beginning it was going to be a very large and complicated undertaking. I was asked by the editor and the licensor to come up with a storyline for Picard that would deal with the fallout of what I unleashed in my novel Section 31 Control, in which Section 31's crimes, and in fact its very existence, are publicly exposed to the Federation at large as well as its interstellar neighbors.
Earl Grey.
Troy looks down at her empty stomach.
Let me do this part. I'm going to act it.
Okay. Troy looks down at her empty stomach and frowns telepathically.
Oh, I wish.
Listeners, you couldn't see it, but I did that.
Oh, okay.
LaForge. Computer, locate a big thing of chips. To the journey!
What about the basics planet?
That planet's not bad. There's a lot of wide open spaces. You just have to avoid going in the caves.
Yeah. I mean, anthropologically speaking.
No spelunking on that planet. You can spelunk on the Borg Una complex, but you can't spelunk on that planet.
No.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
That he said...
He was taking the new body out for a ride?
Yeah, that was great.
I mean, it was a great line. It just doesn't really fit what really happened. Like, he wasn't out there dating other people, you know?
Well, he was trying to figure out who this new Culber was, you know?
No, I know, but it
was funny. It was lighthearted.
Right. It just doesn't fit what he actually did.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture, and that will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you can find all our details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment now to thank our associate producers on Primitive Culture, Amy Nelson, Clara Cook, and Tony Black. Amy is a presenter of many other shows on the network, and you can find her on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson. Clara and Tony were two of the former co-hosts of this show, and they'll be popping back from time to time. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC and Tony at AJ Black Writer.
You're blended, all right.